Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's online event, What Role for Low-Carbon Liquid Fuels in the Energy Transition for the Transport Sector, an event by Fuels Europe in partnership with the Brussels Times. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'm coming at you live from the heart of the EU capital, where we are having a mammoth day of 3 summits. The NATO summit happening right now, the G7 summit happening this afternoon, and an EU summit with the participation of US President Joe Biden tonight. Now, as we have these 3 summits happening right now, energy is a huge, huge part of the discussion, not just because of the energy price rise that we're all seeing while we are just going about our daily lives, but also because of Europe's dependency on Russian energy and the discussion over whether it should be included in sanctions. These are issues we're going to be talking about a little later in our discussion. But we know that the Ukraine war is putting severe pressures on European energy. But anyone who's been involved in the sector knows that these pressures have been around for a long time. Because of course we have the price pressures, we have the security of supplies pressures, but we also have the climate pressures. We have the ambitious EU legislation that is trying to grapple with climate change at the same time as people are feeling the pain at the pump from increasing energy prices. So we have the European Union goal of reducing emissions by 55% by 2030 and arriving at net zero emissions by 2050. And these converging challenges of energy security, energy affordability, and energy emissions are requiring ever more complex solutions. What we're going to be talking about here today is specifically the transport sector, which represents 25%, a quarter, of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions. This has been a tricky sector to decarbonize because it's so central to the European economy, so it's so important to get it right. It's not only a central part of our daily lives, how we get to work, how we get to see our friends, it's also how we're delivered our goods and services. It's basically the connecting thread of all parts of the economy. And really, if policies were to make transport insecure or unaffordable, it would have real destabilizing impacts. So we know that there are various technologies to decarbonize transport, and the European Commission has said it has adopted a technology-neutral approach. So the technology that's been getting maybe the most attention, and probably you guys out there in the audience know the most about, is electrification. We know that there's electric cars becoming more and more on the market. We know that there's very sexy electric cars like Tesla, but there are also other technologies which the Commission says are also equally viable, and they want the market to kind of figure out what is the best technology both for affordability, but also for reducing emissions. So there are other alternative fuels, and they have interesting potential because some of them can work in existing internal combustion engines, whereas electric requires totally new vehicles. But at the same time, concerns have been raised about the feasibility of some of these alternative fuels, things like whether there's enough feedstock, whether there's really enough there to get a market going for these things. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm joined here today by John Cooper, the Director General of Fuels Europe, and we're going to be talking specifically about low-carbon liquid fuels. So this is one of the technologies that can decarbonize transport. It's something that I think there's not a huge amount of public knowledge on. So that's kind of the point of today's event. This is not an event for experts. This is an event for people who use transport. That's everybody. It's to let people know kind of what low-carbon liquid fuels are, what are the policy options for encouraging them? Do we want to encourage them? Maybe we don't. What are the possibilities for how they can be part of decarbonizing transport in the EU? And we're going to be taking your questions via Slido. If you're watching this, you can see the space there on Slido where you can ask your questions. We've already received a whole bunch of great questions, and I'm seeing a whole bunch of questions already about the situation with energy prices and the war in Ukraine, and we're definitely going to get to that as part of our discussion. We're going to be separating out this discussion into particular themes. So we're going to start about talking what are low carbon. We're going to start talking about what are low carbon liquid fuels, and then we're going to go into the industry strategy. We'll talk about sustainability. We'll talk about availability, and that availability largely concerns feedstocks. Can we really get these things going? We'll talk about the social dimension, what kind of effect this will have on the lives of everyday people. And finally, we'll talk about the Ukraine war and how the effects there are going to impact the energy system, the fuel system, and also we'll talk about the sanctions that are being discussed today here in Brussels. And also, if you guys want to participate in the discussion, you can use the hashtag #CleanFuelsForAll on Twitter. Before we get started, I just want to do a Slido poll so we can get an idea of how informed you guys are already. It would be helpful for me to know. So I would ask, are you already familiar with low carbon fuels? I think that that survey should come up on your screen in Slido, and we'll continue on. You guys can answer that. Let me know. Are you familiar already with low carbon liquid fuels? Again, I think we have a mix of people out there, so it's going to be good to really dive into exactly what these are. So John, let me ask you that very basic question first. What are low carbon liquid fuels?
Dave, thanks. Good place to start. And it's a bit of a mouthful. Other people may have heard of biofuels, sustainable biofuels, advanced biofuels, e-fuels, synthetic fuels. Actually, this is intended to cover all of those. We're talking about fuels that are non-fossil, non-petroleum, but do the same job as the fuels we have today: petrol, diesel, jet fuel, marine fuels. And the whole idea is that they can be introduced very easily to replace the use of the liquid fuels today. We have small quantities available today. Our whole strategy that we've developed since the Green Deal, and in fact we started soon after the Paris Agreement, is to scale this up, to make the investments possible, and to make it available much more widely.
And so when we're looking at whether these are going to really be something we'll use every day in our cars, something that will become a part of our reality, are these already available on the market? Can people find these now?
Actually, surprising to many is that there's already 7% of the road transport fuel mix that is made from sustainable biofuels, first generation biofuels we call them. But it's almost invisible to the customer, to the citizen, because it's mixed in. It's not even marked on the pump in a way that's very intelligible. But it's a start. It's been there for several years. But now we're seeing the potential to go significantly further. And we're also seeing some of the companies starting to introduce pumps that offer 100% renewable or a very high level of renewable. There's only a few pumps across Europe so far, but there are also some commercial supply deals to companies already in place supplying 100% renewables. We think we can go much further.
Is it possible that somebody using that pump with 100% renewable could be using it and not even know that it's renewable?
No, I'm pretty sure they would know. At the moment, they are more expensive than petroleum fuels. They are taxed the same way as petroleum fuels. And so anyone that's using those fuels will know, because they'll have made a conscious decision, the pump will be well marked, etc.
So why are they more expensive right now than fossil fuels?
Well, fossil fuels, petroleum has been very well optimized over decades to really be a very efficient process. We have supply of petroleum from 60 countries. And yes, the price goes up and down, but it's still, to produce petroleum fuels, the wholesale price of petroleum fuels is still surprisingly low. It's less than €1 a litre wholesale. And so when you produce these fuels by other processes, there's more equipment involved. The volumes are lower at the moment. The technologies are not as advanced yet. And so they come in at a higher price point. And I did say, they're currently taxed quite highly, we would say, just like petroleum is taxed at effectively at 100%. And so they're still a little bit higher than the cost of petroleum.
So is the issue that right now they're being taxed the same as fossil fuels, as petroleum fuels, and you think that they should be more incentivized by having a more favorable tax regime?
There could be multiple different ways of doing it. Clearly, putting these fuels into a vehicle will give you a very, very low carbon footprint if you're at 100% levels, similar to what you would get with an electric vehicle today. If you look at the life cycle of these vehicles, or even just of the energy, 100% renewable fuels really are outstanding in terms of their greenhouse gas footprint. But with an electrical vehicle, you may be getting some other benefits as well. It could be lower road tax, or it could be business taxation that's different. A number of things help you make the decision to switch to an electric car. And that's good, because electrification really is a great contribution and will have to be a major contribution to the whole strategy of Europe. But currently, the treatment and the incentives for customers to choose renewable fuels are not really there. They're kind of invisible to the customer, and the customer doesn't get a benefit by making that choice. So we're proposing some changes to the system that would make it possible for customers to choose, and that enables us to make bigger investments as well.
So here's a really basic question for you. What's in these fuels? What are they made out of?
Right. So today, our first generation fuels are made mostly from oils and alcohols that are closely related to the food crops that are produced today. And so there's, for good reason, some limits to what we would do with that, because we need to avoid conflict with the production of food. The real growth in this strategy is actually around using lower quality biomass that's already produced in the agriculture and forestry sectors. You think wheat straw, or the stalk of corn, or in forestry, the bark, the twigs, the roots, etc., that is produced with every tree, and at the moment has virtually no usage. And there's actually hundreds of thousands, and in some cases millions of tons of these feedstocks available that are currently largely unused and can be broken down and converted into liquid fuels. We also see longer term the opportunity for e-fuels, which is where you use renewable electricity to make green hydrogen, capture carbon, either from the atmosphere or from an industrial process somewhere, combine the two to make a clean energy molecule that is very similar to petrol or diesel or jet fuel, and it would be completely climate neutral.
So let's talk about the industry's strategy. You guys have a strategy to encourage the development of low-carbon liquid fuels. I mentioned that electrification is probably the alternative transport fuel that people know the most. Is the strategy aimed at competing with electrification?
Really, it isn't, no, because actually, I mean, you look at the members of Fuels Europe, many of them are strongly supporting, with their own strategies, electrification, charging of vehicles, being a member of the Battery Alliance in Europe, and of course, many of them are investing in wind and solar power generation. So their own strategies and our strategies see low-carbon liquid fuels and electrification as complementary, absolutely complementary. Electrification is getting strong policy support. Really, the question that we're asking people to focus on is it really appropriate to make that the exclusive technology and to do it very early? Or should you also consider having a role for liquid fuels in road transport and certainly in aviation and maritime?
So you guys have set a target of 7%, I believe.
No, we're already at 7%.
Already at 7%.
We've been at 7% for some years.
So what's the target then for what makeup we could realistically have in the short term?
Well, let's just say in the long term, by 2050, our target is for all of the remaining liquid fuels to be completely low carbon or climate neutral. And we believe, and we've done the work from the ground up, through the feedstocks, through the technologies, that all remaining liquid needs can be climate neutral by 2050. And along the way, we're certainly talking by 2030, something like a doubling of where we are today. We need the policy signal soon to unleash the investments. The area where there is, I think, a lot of consensus across the Brussels bubble is that we need these fuels for aviation. And we would completely agree. The question is whether we also should go further Maritime also will certainly need fuel, something like this. The jury is still out as to what will be the major fuel in maritime. There's clearly opportunities in the short distance, ferries, etc., for electrification, and certainly also hydrogen. But for long distance shipping, fuels being discussed are ammonia and also methanol. And these are likely related to the strategy that we've got. Our strategy has got a lot of interface and overlap to some degree with the hydrogen strategy of Europe. But in terms of liquids that look like their petroleum counterparts today, aviation is the long-term destination, but we think there's some very good reasons for a number of stakeholders to also have some of this go through the road transport sector.
So you mentioned that the 7% figure. Why isn't that higher now? When did the industry start developing this technology? And why is that, I mean, that's still relatively low. Why is it still so low?
So interestingly, really the first push for biofuels into Europe came soon after the last time the petroleum prices really went very high, when they hit $147 back in about 2008. And at that time, I believe it was actually under the French presidency that there was a push to make more use of the fuel that we can grow in Europe. And it was hand in hand with the agriculture strategy at the time that brought forward the Renewable Energy Directive. And it first came into force in 2010, and the fuels industry was asked to start blending biofuels then. So far, what we've done has focused on, as we've said, the first generation biofuels, because actually there's been a clear political decision to stay at about the 7% level there. And we are saying that that's your starting point. Your next area of growth is to go to the lower quality feedstocks. One of the feedstock that I didn't mention is the waste oils, etc., that come from a range of sources, come from restaurant industry, etc., food processing industries, but also the tallow, animal fats from the meat industries. That's already something we're using. We believe it can go further, and is one of the main sources today for the sustainable aviation fuel that's being produced by our members.
Let's talk a bit more about what low carbon fuels are. We've had a bunch of questions come in from you guys on Slido, specifically wanting to know more about what these are. Maybe before I take some of these Slido questions, could you just clarify a bit the terminology that we're using here? Because there's a lot of different kind of technical terms. So what is a low carbon fuel versus a first generation biofuel, advanced biofuels? We keep hearing about second generation. What does all of this mean?
Okay. So please excuse me, we'll have to go into a bit of a techie moment here. First of all of these fuels are hydrocarbon fuels, like petroleum, and not unlike the foodstuffs that we all survive on, carbohydrates. Carbohydrate, hydrocarbon, very closely related. The carbon in a fossil or petroleum fuel came out of the ground. It was stored through plankton and algae millions of years ago. So we're kind of having a release of carbon from the petroleum that's been stored, which is increasing the atmospheric concentration. Carbon in low carbon fuels is actually carbon that recently came out of the atmosphere. And when you replace that fuel, more will get taken out of the atmosphere. So when you think of a plant that we consume today, if you actually do carbon dating in a lab on that carbon, it will say, this carbon is a few months old. If you do carbon dating on a petroleum fuel, it says, this carbon is millions of years old. We are talking about fuels that are made from biomass or recently captured carbon, where the carbon goes around in a circle, and so it's climate neutral. All of our food is climate neutral. The CO2 you and I are breathing out right now is climate neutral because the food we eat next month will have taken that carbon out of the air again. You do exactly the same with the fuels, and the carbon goes round in a circle. So all of the fuels we're talking about, including first generation biofuels today, all of the carbon is climate neutral. Now, what we say low carbon because at the moment there is really almost nothing that's produced in either food or in biofuels that is zero carbon, because there are some inputs in the agriculture processes, the ploughing of the land, the processing, etc. There are some carbon emissions there. But in terms of a life cycle basis, it comes in much lower than using petroleum.
What about e-fuels and synthetic fuels? Are those
Right.
the same thing or different?
Well, synthetic is a slightly more generic term. You can synthesize a lot of different things. E-fuels specifically focuses on so you've got two building blocks, the hydrogen and the carbon, and you bring them together to make a hydrocarbon fuel. The hydrogen comes from electrolysis of water, green hydrogen, using renewable electricity. The carbon comes from capturing CO2, either from the atmosphere directly or from an industrial process. That's a policy choice as to which one you're recognized in doing. But you're capturing carbon that otherwise would be in the atmosphere, and you chemically combine them, and you start building it up. You start by making typically methane, you turn it into methanol, and from methanol probably into a fully liquid fuel. And that's where we say this strategy has got significant connections with the hydrogen strategy. And e-fuels for us come later in this strategy because you need generous supplies of electricity. There's a common criticism of e-fuels, which is partially valid, and that is they're very inefficient in the way they use electricity. The answer to that is, in the future, when we've really massively scaled up wind and solar, which we must do, we absolutely must do, there will be times when we simply have too much, sometimes even far too much electricity. Think of a windy day in the summer with long daylight hours. Or you can put in solar installations in areas where there's almost no demand for electricity. Think North Africa, where you can then afford to go through a process to make things like synthetic fuels. And the beauty of that process is a liquid fuel is much, much easier to transport from those regions and much easier to store for the long term than electricity or even a gaseous fuel. And that physical advantage of liquid energy is something that we see gives great value to this strategy.
So let's take a question from Slido. So Julia Morris, who's out there watching, asks, how does the technology behind low carbon fuels work, and how can they be climate neutral in practice? Isn't it impossible by definition?
So the technology is actually about 5 different technology groups around the first generation, the advanced, and let me just say something, 2 key technologies in the advanced biofuels area, 2 key areas to break down biomass. You either use enzymes in an enzymatic process, which involves essentially making a soup of the biomass, and you have very high-tech enzymes that break down, make alcohols, you take the alcohols into the fuels. Or you use a process known as Fischer-Tropsch, that has been used for some decades. Originally, it was used to produce liquid fuels from coal, but you can equally use it to break down woody biomass of all different kinds, whether it was from agriculture or forestry. You essentially have a gasification process, and then you rebuild it to liquids. The technologies are well established. They will benefit from being scaled up. But all of these pilot plants exist already in producing many tons a day, and in a few cases, hundreds or thousands of tons a day. It's a question of scaling them up to make millions of tons of this product. How can they be climate neutral? It's actually the answer I gave before. There's nothing wrong with using carbon as an energy carrier, and carbon and hydrogen are much more practical to work with than hydrogen itself, as long as that carbon is in a cycle. And we're mimicking what we do with the food cycle at scale, but going into lower quality biomass to avoid the interference with the food cycle.
Well, we have a question from Sylvia, who I think was intrigued by your mentioning that these types of fuels are available out there.
Yeah.
She wants to know where. So Sylvia asks, are these low carbon alternatives readily available now? It would be good to know where to find them. So are these all over Europe? Where could people find them?
So actually, Fuels Europe website, will give you information on that. Fuels Europe, we represent a large number of companies. They've put their information there. So fuelseurope.eu is the place to go to look for more information, including where you can get those.
So we have a question from Guillaume, and it's about, I think probably gets to the heart of the issue, the comparative benefits of these low carbon liquid fuels. So Guillaume says, and you can respond to it, they should be totally carbon-free fuels and not just low-carbon fuels. So why are they low-carbon fuels versus carbon-free fuels, and are other alternatives like electric really carbon-free?
Well, I think the answer to that is almost nothing in society now is truly carbon-free. Even wind power clearly at the moment has got a footprint from the installation and the maintenance. We are gradually working through as society how to put all of the inputs into all of these different processes to be based on 100% renewables. So it's a gradual process. So yes, of course, producing electric cars, the mining of the materials, the transport of the materials, the production of the battery cells. At the moment, everybody's on a journey to take the carbon intensity out of that. But at the moment, all of those, together with agriculture around the world, has got a carbon footprint. So we're going through a gradual process of getting it down. The reason we say low carbon is because of the inputs, not the, if you like, the carbon released from the actual use of the fuel itself.
So an anonymous questioner asks if you could put a number on what low carbon fuels are in terms of greenhouse gas intensity.
At the moment, 70 to 90% better than petroleum.
Okay, good. So Niklas Lovqvist wants to know how these low carbon liquid fuels are produced. Who are the largest suppliers globally of the inputs and outputs currently?
So actually many of the members of Fuels Europe are already producing significant quantities. And in fact, if you look sustainable aviation fuel, what is used in Europe today, I think almost all of it will be produced by the members that we have. In terms of countries, let me just answer in terms of countries. There are a number of countries that have got large agriculture and forestry that are significant producers. I mean, globally, clearly, Brazil has a very, very large ethanol production facility. In terms of in Europe, the agricultural countries of Europe, Poland, Hungary, France, Germany, all significant producers. Actually, I mean, clearly Ukraine had some production there. There's obviously Ukraine will have another conversation about later. But the agricultural activity of Ukraine has been huge, and already there were significant plans for biofuels and advanced biofuels production in Ukraine.
Let's hone in on sustainability as a topic. So you mentioned that GHG number. So who measures that actually? Who measures the sustainability and sets the GHG performance?
So actually, there's a really thorough process described by the European Commission as part of the Renewable Energy Directive. And it requires all of the sources of biofuels, first generation or advanced, to be audited and to have reporting of their sustainability criteria. And that includes essentially all of the direct inputs into the process, from the agriculture, the working of the soil, right through to the processing and the logistics. I've heard it described by very knowledgeable experts as the strongest set of sustainability standards for any agriculture anywhere in the world for any product. And I'm not really in a position to challenge or dispute that, but this is a reliably provided opinion. Certainly they are stringent, and they have been in place for some time, and they are regularly audited, and the industry complies.
Now, we know that with biofuels, there were huge concerns about how they affect food supplies, both for their direct use and their indirect causes, so a phenomenon called indirect land use change. People may have heard of this ILUC by its acronym. So do low carbon liquid fuels have such direct and indirect impacts on food supplies? In other words, turning crops that should be used for food into fuel instead?
That's an important question. So the clear strategy that we have for the growth of the supply of these fuels is to use largely existing biomass. So you think when wheat is grown, actually what you use is, that collection of seeds, the grains at the top of the plant. And the rest mostly is unused. There is some of that used for soil conditioning. In some cases, in some areas, you also use it for what's called animal husbandry. You put it in barns and stables and things. But there's a significant amount that's available, which at the moment is largely or very often burned to stubble on the ground or simply wasted. Similarly in forestry, if you go to large forestry installations, sustainable forestry produces waste. The demand for, as I understand it, the demand for timber and forestry products now is very much focused on the very high quality wood in the core of the tree. We used to have a newspaper industry that used all the lower quality stuff. There's a phrase I've heard from the forestry industry: the iPad killed the newspaper, right? And so there's now hundreds of thousands of tons of forestry waste that's available, which is actually energy stored, but it's in rather a messy solid form. And with the right process, you get it through to liquids. So the whole strategy is to use largely existing biomass, where we will simply interrupt the process of decomposition and use that energy in fuels instead. One other area that is quite exciting there is the use of what's called cover crops, where in many agricultural systems, the fields may be bare for several months of the year. And there's an opportunity there that farmers could work with us to produce crops that work for certain processes that otherwise simply wouldn't be grown. And it has to be worked into the system so that in terms of crop rotation, health of the soil, etc., it works. But that's very much the strategy, to use existing biomass and biomass that has got no conflict with the food system. We absolutely recognize, and we cannot have a system that encourages deforestation. The forests are critical.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that deforestation issue as well, because that's obviously another big concern with these types of fuels. So what kind of safeguards are in place to make sure that it's not resulting in deforestation?
So actually that relates back to the Renewable Energy Directive and the sustainability criteria that are there. It includes clear history of the land use, and land that is recently deforested cannot produce biofuels that qualify in Europe. So it's in place, it works, and we recommend continuing with that. Can I just say a moment as well? There's always a question about, so how much can you make? It sounds to some people when you describe this that it's really limited. And in fact, there are many in Brussels who say, yes, we want these fuels, but only aviation, because there won't be enough. So we've understood that challenge clearly. And so what we did to answer that was to go and find a reputable body that could study and look at this about how you produce and what quantities of feedstock you can produce. And we went to Imperial College consultants in London, and we asked them to describe what's available. The study is available on the Concawi website, concawi.eu. And the simple answers are for 2050, or actually in total when we can get there, it's around 150 million tons of oil equivalent of products. That's actually a lot more feedstock than that tonnage, because you need typically more tons of feedstock, a few tons to produce a ton of finished fuel. But those are feedstocks that are a combination of what's available today, what can be developed with cover crops that I described, and for the later years, what can be done in e-fuels. Now, for all of the biomass, that's European sourced, and that means that would come from European agriculture across the EU. You'd create jobs and rural income by doing that, because you'd be paying people to aggregate biomass, pre-process it, and transport it to the production facilities. In the case of e-fuels, part of that envisages doing that out of Europe, such as the North Africa example I gave earlier, where the economics are great. the studies that have been done so far show that it really does look very attractive to do that, and that the costs can be really very, very competitive by doing that at scale in parts of North Africa.
Yeah, let's dive into that feedstock availability issue. You mentioned the availability worldwide and that some of it's coming from Europe. So what exactly could come from Europe? What would need to be imported? Would different regions, like would some regions be using biofuels while others are using e-fuels based on local feedstock availability?
The strategy we've described is that all of the biomass can come from Europe, from the existing sources, the existing land, and alongside the existing food system. Whether it comes from outside or not, there are some political questions as to whether and how Europe chooses to trade with other regions. The fact that we can do that strategy in Europe also, suggests that, this is, if this strategy is possible in Europe, let's say it this way, if this strategy is possible in Europe, it's also something that is adoptable for many other regions of the world. Europe is a relatively small landmass, and compared with the big continents of Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, the potential for biomass into energy is really very, very substantial. But to be clear, we've recognized Europe's policy wish to have greater energy independence, and that's why we've focused on what feedstocks are available primarily in Europe. And to clarify again, the biomass portion of that is all to be sourced in Europe.
So we talked a bit about how this feedstock may or may not be competing with food crops. What about, so we have a question here from Slido, from an anonymous questioner, who talks about possible other uses for the feedstock. So they ask, couldn't the biomass waste material, such as straw or wood, be better used to make, rather than biofuels, to be integrated into housing material for insulation, locking the carbon away instead of burning it and focusing on e-fuels instead?
That's interesting. I expect you to go into another area, and actually I'll answer the other area as well in this. So the work that we've done envisages already a significant amount of biomass going into power generation and biogas. And so we are a long way from saying all of this biomass is ours. The production of materials for construction, I think that's interesting. I'm not sure I've got a complete answer to that. The amounts of biomass overall available are really surprisingly large. And we are also struck by the fact that agriculture can adapt and often produce co-products, or for that matter, if there is part of the plant that you use for construction, there may be other plants that you can use, other parts of the plant that can go to energy uses, either for liquids or biogas. We are really talking about a further optimization of the whole use of agriculture in Europe. And at some point, you have to include agricultural experts and farmers in that discussion.
Let's talk about the social dimension of this change. What will be the impact for your average consumer? So let's say that these are taken up as road transport fuels. Right. How will that impact a normal person if they need to switch from conventional fuels to low carbon liquid fuels?
Yep. So look, I'm going to include in that there's a bit of discussion you have to have with the government, the member state government here. The first thing and the simple thing to say is that low carbon liquid fuels, synthetic fuels, e-fuels, etc., can go straight into today's cars, trucks, because they're designed to be largely drop-in. The same we can do with aircraft. If you meet the same specification, they can go in straight away. And so actually, if somebody goes and buys 100% renewable fuel today, they immediately have a vehicle that has got a similar carbon footprint, potentially better than an electric vehicle on the road today, because you've not got the footprint of a production of a larger battery, which today is not typically made entirely through renewable electricity. So first of all, that is available today. There's a couple of things we would say. First of all, because the taxation level is the same for a fossil or a renewable, they'll end up paying a little more for that fuel today. And then they get no recognition in policy. Their car is still described as a 95 gram per kilometer car, for example. They'll still say pay the same road tax. They won't get free parking or bus lane use or congestion charge relief. They'll see no benefits. There's nothing to make them feel good about the purchase that they've just made. Likely also with a trucking company, they'll pay the same road tolls. Their trucks will be described as if they're describing 100% fossil fuel use as well. But we think there's a missed opportunity here that actually this should be seen as complementary to electrification and in some cases an alternative. And certainly in the medium term, we think it's an additional way for society to have further decarbonization. You think of what's happening today with electric vehicles. There's a very strong policy support to get customers to buy these with policy incentives. But in fact, the cost of the electric cars are going up. And I'll quote very recent data from the Financial Times, an article that was published on effects of the Ukraine crisis and the metals prices. Only a few days ago, this article was explaining that the metals inputs for an electric car have gone up by $7,000 US dollars since the start of the pandemic. Combination of nickel, cobalt, and lithium costs. And then this article went on to also highlight the fact that car makers are responding by actually taking out the lowest cost vehicles out of their range. So the starter 10 or 12,000 euro car is disappearing. And then another article from Bloomberg, again a few days ago, focusing on the pricing that Tesla is offering for its lowest cost model, the Tesla Model 3, that was announced as having a $35,000 US dollar starting price and is now at $47,000. The evidence is in the market that car prices are going up. And in Europe, one of the key drivers is the high cost of the CO2 compliance and getting to the cost of a full electric car. What does that mean socially? It means that at the moment, only the wealthier people can buy an electric car. Worth remembering also that large parts of Europe typically don't buy a new car. A study we had done, again available on Fuels Europe website, a study done by Studio Gear up in the Netherlands, looked at the income levels in about 10 different European countries against the car prices today for electric and ICE cars. And in quite a lot of countries in Europe, the majority of the population can't afford to buy an ICE car new, let alone an EV, and the EV is moving further away. So where we're heading is dangerous territory where we could have an us and them situation. The wealthier part of society that can afford to have an electric car and receive significant taxation benefits, and also the warm feeling of doing the right thing, whereas the other part of society will be using an internal combustion engine car. And even if they get renewable fuels for that, they'll have the higher costs, they'll be paying taxes that could be cross-subsidizing the other sector that is using the electric car. That's exactly what European policy sets up today. Our point is, if you allow somebody to use a renewable fuel in a cheaper car, could be a new car, or it could be an older car, they should also receive some of that benefit and also the recognition that they're doing the right thing. And that recognition, that very human part of it, for us is part of the conversation because that's actually what creates the pull of a market to say we want more of this. And our problem with the Renewable Energy Directive, while it's a really good instrument and it's really brought us to where we are today with our 7%, to go further, the fact that the red compliance is invisible, we don't think it's enough. We think you need to have that dialogue with the customer, and the customer feels that they want to do the right thing, and they get recognized when they do it.
Well, on that question of policy incentives, we've had a question come in from Slido about how emissions are measured, this tailpipe emissions issue. So JB asks, what are the chances of using low carbon fuels in cars, knowing that the directive on CO2 emissions for cars only looks at the tailpipe emissions and not the life cycle of electric vehicles and ICE cars? Does this directive not close the door to these fuels?
Largely, yes, it does. This has been a debate that's gone for some time. And I think we recognize that moving to a life cycle basis is really complicated because you have to go right back to mines across the world for where battery materials were produced, etc. Even a well-to-wheels basis could be complicated. But we have suggested that there is a way of having a correction factor that could be used, or some way of recognizing that, in particular, if a vehicle is used for a long time, I'll come back to that, then you should have a way of adjusting that CO2 rating of the vehicle. A long time. Now, that requires assurance. We absolutely recognize you need assurance. We think the right way to do that is long-term contracts. A truck operator that has a long-term contract for fuel, a vehicle leasing company that has a long-term arrangement to supply the vehicle for its economic life with fuel. That's actually a benefit for us as well. If we have a long-term contract for the demand, we can invest to produce additional supply for that. It's like you had the feed-in tariffs and the contract for difference for renewable power, electricity, solar and wind. Really effective for those industries to get them really scaled up. That's what we'd like to try and achieve in policy to really scale up these industries as well.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Ukraine war and rising energy prices. First off, maybe could you explain why prices at the pump have increased so much in recent times, knowing that this price increase started before the outbreak of the war, right?
Right. So the whole energy complex was going up from around September last year, and the single biggest driver was energy demand from China, and some other countries as well, but in particular China, to some extent India. And what was happening there was a really big scale up of industrial production, and that needs a lot of electricity, that needs gas to produce the electricity, and coal. And if you look from the market data from that period, everything started going up. As gas went up, coal also went up. And we also saw the very unusual and unexpected occurrence of even oil going into power generation in some countries in the world. And so they've all kind of pulled each other up, and it was very much energy demand from China. And cargoes of gas that would have gone to Europe were being outbid and taken to China. And so we've ended up with a bidding war over who gets this cargo of LNG somewhere on the ocean between wherever it was produced, whether it was Australia or whether it was the US or the Middle East. And cargoes have, in some cases, they've turned round. So that was happening before. We've also seen, obviously, the Ukraine situation. Russia is a very significant producer of gas for Europe and oil globally. And it's now clear the direction of travel that Europe has announced there. What is interesting is that even though there are no sanctions specifically on oil at the moment, the market, the member companies of Fuels Europe, have largely commercially sanctioned, if you like, already, not buying Russian crude. They are, in fact, ahead of the Commission in that respect. And that's something that's already happened. It gives them a little less choice in the market. Cargoes are coming further. Russia clearly was in an economically advantaged place there with direct pipeline supply into several parts of Eastern Europe. And I think there's a great deal of activity that is going on to plan for how the market and the companies can respond to the clear direction of travel that the European Commission has set. And that applies for oil. Of course, it also applies for gas.
So with all of that in mind, Matteo from Slido is asking, with oil prices increasing, with fuel prices increasing, does this put these low-carbon liquid fuels in a good place to be kind of sped up, that the policy might want to speed these up as a way to alleviate rising prices at the pump and have more energy security, less dependence on Russia?
Low-carbon liquid fuels, we've said, will be more expensive than petroleum fuels, but the rising cost of petroleum has actually significantly closed the gap. The other thing, of course, you have to talk about whether it's taxation or other policy incentives are available. We think that these can be made very attractive to customers with relatively small changes in the way that policy works today. And of course, the other aspect is that we are talking about a way to significantly grow more fuel in Europe. Let me just say as well, in the current circumstance, we really do have to be sensitive to the fact that agriculture of the world is disturbed significantly by the grains crisis that's emerging through the loss of access to Russian and Ukraine production. And we have to think carefully about how the strategy we've described interacts with that, because we have to feed the world.
So with that in mind, so it's complicated, clearly, the pricing structures.
Yeah.
How exactly are these pricing structures set, and where do these low-carbon liquid fuels fit into that? What makes a price go up or down, and would it be the same for a low-carbon liquid fuel?
Well, the pricing is actually very, very much linked to the way that policy treats the compliance with CO2 targets. And actually, we already have the policy instruments there. It's just a question of what is included in compliance. So CO2 in cars has got a compliance price of around 500 euros a ton of carbon. So around 6 or 7 times the ETS price today, which is a really, really high number. It's the same for the trucking CO2 regulation. The fuel taxation that we have today equates to a carbon price, if it was described in carbon terms, of around 200 to 250 euros a ton of carbon. Those two regulations alone at the moment are blind to biogenic or captured carbon in the fuel. So we can make these fuels completely climate neutral, and they would be ignored by those regulations. If you put both of those regulations in a way that actually recognize the biogenic carbon, all of these fuels would be economic overnight.
Now, we know that over the next 2 days, EU leaders are going to be talking about the possibility of an import ban of Russian, probably the most we can expect is Russian oil and coal phased in. I think probably gas is off the table. That seems to have been made clear by Germany. What kind of effect would an oil import ban have on the transport fuel markets? And would it be that different? You mentioned that the market is kind of going in this direction anyway. Would it be the dramatic effect that we heard described yesterday from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz?
Let me say, long-term, historically, oil and fuels markets have had a track record of coping very well with shocks, albeit with some price effects for the short term. But in traders' terms, and excuse the pun, the global markets are very liquid. What that means is that there's extensive shipping capability for very large quantities, and the infrastructure is largely there to move large volumes. Having said that, there are some very strong regional issues. Several of the refineries that supply Eastern European countries from East Germany right, down through Poland and Bulgaria and Romania are direct pipeline fed from Russia with Russian crudes. And there will have to be very careful work to work out how to supply those. There could be options in some cases with rail. In 1 or 2 options, there are alternative pipelines. In the case of rail cars, you need a lot of them. And there would likely be investment required to put in certain key kit. And so it's a mixed picture across Europe. Europe also imports around 10% of its diesel from Russia at the moment, about 20% overall. The rest typically comes from the Middle East and the US. And in the short term, that diesel market could also be tight. The market tends to respond over a period of months rather than days, and production, access to crude oil and refining around the world can adapt. It's something that, and I think the European Commission understand this, while a direction of travel has been set, it's not unlike the gas. It's maybe not quite as severe as the gas situation, but it's something that should be a planned transition rather than an overnight switch.
Well, before we close out, I want to take a question on the policy, because we've talked a bit about policy and policy incentives. And maybe we could close with getting an impression of what actually needs to change in terms of policy. We're here in the regulatory capital of the world. Carolina Rossi says, very interesting discussion, thank you. You mentioned policy signals to unleash the investments needed for low carbon liquid fuels. What would that signal need to be?
Two answers, one for the customer and one for the investor. For the customer, we want the customer to have an opportunity to buy something that is no more expensive overall for them than today's fuel prices. And actually, I would have said the same before the Ukrainian war. Before the fuel prices, it's got to be similar to what they currently pay. And that has got to involve the taxation discussion, not only at European level, but at member state level as well. And there's a number of different things, and it could involve vehicle taxation, it could involve fuels taxation. The new proposed ETS for transport and buildings is in there as well. The answer would be a 2-day, 3-day workshop, so I'm not going to go further into detail there. But let me come back to what does the investor need, because our real wish here is that we scale this up substantially. Not to replace petroleum completely, because we don't need to. Electrification will do a big part of that job, and hydrogen will also do a big part. But for the pieces that we do need, which is maybe about 1/3 of the total petroleum volumes today, we need to invest. Every investor needs to justify a $1 billion project to put high-tech steel and processes, stainless steel, control systems into the ground to produce these different fuels. And what you need for that is a clear signal from the policies that the demand will be there and that the policies support getting a fair price for your production for something like 10 years. It's a little bit like starting a new job and trying to buy an apartment at the same time. You want to take out a mortgage. The bank wants to know, are you going to be employed with a decent salary for the next 10 years or 15 years so that I can be secure lending you the money? It's a very similar mindset. So we need to make hundreds of those billion-dollar investments to succeed in this over the next 20 years. And the investor wants to have the certainty from the policymakers. And that's why I come back to the point of we need to think of a way of describing compliance with these policies that looks and feels like a long-term contract, a contract for difference, like we had for wind and solar. It worked for those, it can work for us.
Good. Well, I think that's probably a good place to leave it there. I hope that you guys at home have learned a little bit more than you did when you started about low-carbon liquid fuels. I think what's interesting to hear is that they're out there. You can find them. And at the Fuels Europe website, they show you where exactly you can find these. You could find them blended in mysterious, unlabeled ways, or you can find them actually labeled at a machine, at a petrol station, to be able to fill. And I think John, you gave us an impression of where the pricing is going. And I think as you explained, their pricing structures are really, really complicated. But we know that, well, there's a huge element of unpredictability here going forward, I think, because of the already rising energy prices and the Ukraine war. But we know that we are going to be living in a changed world now where our energy prices will be going up inevitably. And so some of these new technologies, these new solutions for energy, I think are going to be increasingly sought after. And certainly, as we're seeing here in Brussels today and tomorrow, the subject of energy has been bumped up to the very top of the political agenda. So John, thank you so much for walking us through all of this. And thank you so much at home for following along with us and asking some great questions. I wish you all a great afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.